And now it's a great pleasure to introduce our acclaimed Laureate Professor of Microbiology and Immunology, Peter Doherty. A headline about Peter in Cosmos magazine once said that winning a Nobel Prize is about as easy as wrestling a pig, a reference to his days as a veterinary scientist. In fact, it's probably harder and more tough. As Peter himself has proved through an extraordinary, hard-working career spanning pathology, microbiology and immunology across several continents. He's made an important contribution to human knowledge by his determination to follow the evidence from research, even when that evidence proves unsettling and unnerving. Peter shared the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1996 with his Swiss colleague, Rolf Zinkernagel, for the discovery of how the immune system recognises virus-infected cells. He was named Australian of the Year in 1997. We're delighted at Melbourne to have Peter as a very active presence on our campus, both for himself and for the continuous contribution he makes to public debate. Many of us know Peter Doherty through his witty and insightful books, The Beginner's Guide to Winning the Nobel Prize and the wonderful A Light History of Hot Air. These are ways he uses to talk to a wider public about core issues in science. Recently he warned, and I quote, that we need to face up to the reality of climate change and renewable sources of energy. And until we do that, we won't get anywhere and we won't find the wisdom to meet the challenges at hand. There's no more appropriate person to open our Festival of Ideas on climate change, cultural change. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Doherty.
Thanks, Glenn, and thank you, Laia, for reminding us of the human dimension of this whole issue, because it is a massive issue. As the Vice-Chancellor said, my real field of expertise is microbiology, immunology and pathology. I'm an experimentalist, so that if you combine those fields together, you get experimental mythology, which is what I do for a living. And I guess I've been asked to open this because I know a lot less about it than most of the people who are going to be speaking. That may be a qualification. But of course, if you're a Nobel Prize winner, you can speak with authority on absolutely everything, which is one of the dangers, especially as Alzheimer's gets us as we join the ranks of the elderly. So I'm actually still an active scientist. And I work with two very bright groups of young people at the St Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. And the Vice-Chancellor talked about wrestling a pig. That's the sort of thing they do in Memphis, Tennessee. It's a very muddy place. They're very much into hogs. And we work there on the early stages of influenza virus infection, and we're into some kind of big science of systems biology, which is a lot of mathematics and computing. We're collaborating with a multi-centre effort, trying to understand what goes on in the influenza virus-infected lung. Now, I mention this because over the last 10 years or so, the realities of science in my area, in experimental biology, have changed out of all sight. And they've changed out of all sight because of advances in technology, advances in readout systems, advances in computing, and massive capacity for number crunching. And this has gone across the whole of science. It's not just biology, it's what determines what's happening in this whole area of climate science, which is even more dependent on those sorts of advances. And so a lot of historical knowledge, I think, in fields is useful, but it's only useful really if you're interacting with the people who are doing the contemporary stuff. And at the moment I'm still involved to some extent, so I'm not totally historic or toast, as the Americans would say. The other group is at the University of Melbourne, and we're working on what I've been doing for years, the killer T-cell. I'll show you a little bit of that, though it has nothing whatsoever to do with climate change, but I've got to fill this up somehow or other. And I thought I was giving a 40-minute talk, and I've been given 55 minutes, and actually Nobel Prize winners can speak for hours and hours, especially if they have Irish background. This is the facility at St Jude Children's Research Hospital, which is a wonderful and very wealthy institution. This facility here, I don't see if you can see the rubbish tins outside, is the Department of Microbiology at the University of Melbourne, which there's only been one other building like this on campus, and they recently knocked it down, and it's currently filling up with the new neuroscience building, which is a wonderful building. And this is the proposed, one of the proposals for the new microbiology building, which will be the former Ampol headquarters and now motel on the corner of Grattan Street and Royal Parade, which we got some money out of the feds for that.
In your honour?
Yeah, kind of. Well, we'll see. Anyway, so being involved in science is kind of great, and it's a great privilege, of course, to be able to talk with a lot of bright young people. And though people say the young are turning away from science, we certainly have some wonderful young people working in science, in microbiology at least, at Melbourne University. Right. We get this thing to change. Oh, yeah. I'm not going to go into this. That's influenza virus, and we all know about influenza. All Victorians now are authorities on influenza. I don't need to tell you about it. They're ducks. Influenza. Well, I did train as a vet. Influenza is actually a disease of aquatic birds, which gets across into us and causes problems, as you know. And this is just to show you influenza spreading. This is a seasonal influenza spreading across the United States. The swine flu is not spreading as rapidly as the seasonal influenzas, but you can see that this is typical influenza. It starts in Texas, as a lot of really bad things do. And it goes right across the United States in about 6 weeks. And, of course, influenza is a scary disease, and it's being a respiratory infection. It's not one of those infections you can decide to change your behaviour and not get it. And, of course, it is spread very quickly around the world by international air travel. And so if with climate change we no longer have jet planes, trying to deal with it, we no longer have jet planes, maybe we'll pick up on the flu a bit and be a bit protected. Now, influenza is not one of the diseases that's going to be greatly impacted by climate change. Some diseases are. We think mosquito-borne diseases, for instance, we will get them moving further away from the tropics and more into the northern and southern latitudes, and also we're already seeing some evidence of diseases like malaria in Africa, which are normally in the low-lying areas, starting to move up the hills into the cooler areas, which is a matter of considerable distress, because malaria, for instance, kills about 500,000 kids a year. It's still a very bad disease, and it's one of those diseases we only just control. You know, there's a lot of things in particularly infectious disease and so forth that we're just in control of. Change the balance too much, and we could have serious issues. This is what I work on. These are killer T cells bouncing around on some tumour cells, and I don't think you'll see it very well with the light on, but this is one of them actually doing some killing. That's going to kill that. See? That's killed. That is, I can tell you as a veterinary pathologist, that is dead. I mean, it's a silent witness sort of stuff, you know, but not quite as gory. Next slide. Here we are. So, a biologist's view. Well, as Glenn said, I'm trained as a vet. So, and I was trained in the veterinary school at the University of Queensland, which wasn't a kind of sort of puppy dog medicine place. It was a place that was designed to service the agricultural industries of the great state of Queensland. You know, Queensland didn't have a university until 1912, wasn't it? 1919. And the reason, and of course, this university is founded in 1853. And the reason Queensland didn't have a university through all those years, Tasmania had one at about the same time as, not much after Victoria, in fact. The reason Queensland didn't have one is because the people who controlled the state did not want the young men to become white-gloved aesthetes who would not work the agricultural industries. I'm told things have changed in Queensland. I'm not quite, never quite convinced. But anyway, we were trained in the veterinary school because they realised the example of the agricultural and mechanical universities in the United States, they could actually have people trained in a university to do some practical things. And the vet school trained us in the breed 'em, feed 'em, eat 'em school of veterinary medicine, which is not really regarded sympathetically by the breathless young people who do vet science now, but that's what we did. And so I'm sort of constrained into thinking about things like carrying capacity of a system and genetics and statistics and all those sorts of things. And we talk in the climate change thing, they talk a lot about forcings. I've been trying to learn some of this terminology and language, of course, as I've tried to understand what's going on with this. And the primary forcing of climate change and environmental effects, degradation, all the rest of it, is really human numbers. Now, of course, there's not a great deal we can do about that. We have to deal with the reality of it. But I think you have to consider that these three things all go together, that the population increase, environmental degradation, species loss, and climate change. And we can't really think of them in isolation. But mostly this evening we're going to talk about climate change. I read up on it. I got very interested in this because I was being asked a lot of questions about it. And like all of you, I'm concerned about it. I mean, people don't come out to lectures like this and to occasions like this unless they're concerned about the issue that's being discussed. And so I read into it a lot from about 2005. And it's not easy for a biologist, even someone like me who has been doing some science for quite a long time, to read into an area like this, because it's from the physical sciences, the language is very different, and the various languages of science are very different. We don't all speak in the same way, we use different terminology, and we have different types of approaches, and we do different types of science. And this is very different for me. So I looked into it a lot and read up on it and wrote a kind of a very tentative book, which is the light history of hot air. It's actually as much about political hot air and hot air balloons and spontaneous human combustion as it is about climate change. But that's really the reason I went into it. I didn't realise when we put a balloon on the cover, which is Louise Adler's choice, of course, that I was talking about this in Scotland, and someone gave me this Scottish dictionary which defined a balloon as a Glasgow term for someone who's full of hot air and whose opinions, though loudly and frequently expressed, are regarded as worthless. I took out the qualification, says, for instance, people involved in making 5-year plans for universities and things like that. I mean, I hope that doesn't... No, we got one, have we? I missed it. Okay, good. So, anyway, it was a lot of fun doing this, but I don't know if I informed the climate change community very much as a result. So the question is, I think, for those of us who are not professional climate scientists, is where do we get our information on this stuff? I found some sources that I think are very good. I think, for instance, this book, The Long Thaw, is a very nice book by a geophysicist, very readable, few references on the actual science of climate change. It's written very conservatively, and it actually explains a lot of what the discussion is about and a lot of what the controversies are and where the uncertainties are. Because, of course, in an area that's as complex as this, there will be many, many uncertainties. Nothing is written in stone in this, unless you're a geologist, of course, where everything is written in stone. The National Academies of Sciences are all engaged, and they all have websites that will deal with various aspects of this. Books written for general reading, like these. This one is actually a scary book. I haven't been able to finish it yet. It left me too frightened when I read it, and we're all doomed if this one's right. News and Views Perspectives. For those of us who are in the university and can access, say, a university library on the web, I find the general discussions in the science journals, the leading science journals, to be very useful, where you have people summarising the actual science. When you try to read the papers, though, it's almost like trying to read sociology. It's in a different language. It's not English. It's unfamiliar. It's Urdu or something. But anyway... And then government websites. One that's particularly useful, I think, is the NOAA website of the United States. If you want to see the pictures of Arctic melting and all the rest of it, of course, they're very much concerned with the Northern Hemisphere. Skepticism and denial in science. Just some general things about skepticism and denial. Skepticism is absolutely central to science. Good scientists are skeptical. And I think one of the reasons that Australians do relatively well in science, for the size of our population, is that we're naturally pretty skeptical. We're a nation of knockers, basically. And this is skepticism. This is scientist's hell. The poor guy goes to hell and he's condemned to be in the psychics and astrology section of hell. Of course, if you go along to the bookstore, you'll find that the astrology section is 3 times as big as the science section. So we get to know where we stand. This is denial. This is the dead parrot sketch from Monty Python. Michael Palin, who is the business person, is in denial that the parrot is dead. And John Cleese is insisting that it is. I mean, he bangs it up and down on the table. It is a dead parrot. But that doesn't necessarily convince our entrepreneur. A proper skepticism. I think we do need to be skeptical, and we need to be skeptical about what we do, but it's very difficult to be a serious skeptic about something you don't really understand very well. It's easy for me to be skeptical in my own field. I've often had the experience where some research is published and we really don't think it's quite right, and we may repeat the experiment, or we may go and look at some different experiment that looks at it in a different way and perhaps find that it is right, or perhaps come to a different conclusion. It's much more difficult to be skeptical about something you're not into. How do you do that? Well, in the end analysis, if you're a scientist, you have to say to yourself that unless you can see obvious flaws that are so obvious that it's egregious, you have to really say that you respect the people that are doing it, you respect that they're obeying the rules of science and that they're operating via proper peer review mechanisms and that their stuff is being published in leading journals. And so you think that what they're saying has probably got some validity to it. You like to see different opinions of it. You like to see different people looking at it from different points of view. And particularly, you like to see the conclusions supported by somewhat different sorts of science. But you can't be absolutely certain, of course. And then, of course, there are people who are in quite, particularly about climate science, we know, who think that the whole thing is totally overblown, that, for instance, Ian Plimer, who writes, I've read his book, he writes very compellingly about the geological changes and what's happened with climate science or climate change through geological time. I found that very useful. I think that's his area of expertise, and I think he does that quite well. He really scared the hell out of me, actually, because there have been massive events that are caused by natural events that would be completely outside our control. We could do nothing about it. I mean, we can't influence the tilt of the Earth's axis, for instance. We can't influence its orbit, how elliptical it is or how circular it is, and all those sorts of things. So actually what Ian Plimer convinced me, and I'm not sure that that's what he really intends with his book, that we should do everything possible now to do what we're talking about when we're trying to reverse anthropogenic climate change. We should try and stabilise human numbers, because the more human beings are on the planet, if we get a big disaster, the bigger the disaster will be. And we should try and keep all our fossil fuels and uranium and so forth as much as possible as an energy reserve in case something really goes wrong over which we have absolutely no control. For instance, if we got a massive asteroid hit and it blocked out the sun and we couldn't get photosynthesis, where would we get our energy? And the non-renewable energy sources might actually then become enormously important. Now, the book itself, I think, has got some problems, and various people have been going into it. This is a strange area, this whole area of climate science, climate denial, and all the rest of it, with a lot of people in considerable controversy. I don't want to go into it to a great extent, but Ian Enting from the University of Melbourne looks into a lot of the mathematical reinterpretations that various people on the denial side of things make, and has written a book about that. And he's actually looking very hard at this book. The book has more than 2,000 references, but what really bothered me about it was that all the data that's given, and there's quite a bit of data, we're not told where any of it comes from, so we'll just leave it at that, I think. Denial. Now, I think any of us who are in science, especially if we're talking publicly about science and trying to interface publicly, are familiar with the fact that denial is a part of what happens when humans confront science that has profound implications. Because science is often threatening in one way or another. It's threatening to all sorts of interests, established financial, business, religious and social interests, for example. And denial could come from the right or the left. It's not a political, and climate science, I think, is not a political issue. It's not a left-right issue, though some people try to paint it that way. Also, if denial serves powerful interests, it brings into the scene all sorts of rather marginal people who are now put into considerable prominence. For instance, we read that 30% of scientists don't believe in climate change. They include everyone who's got a science degree and at some stage of their life and is maybe teaching high school. So it doesn't not that I wish to disparage people who are teaching high school, but it doesn't mean it's talking about the professional scientists, and it's certainly not talking about the professional scientists who are looking into this area. When I've asked the climate scientists which of the professional scientists who are serious scientists who are working in the area are actually highly sceptical about the conclusions from climate science, the people that I've talked to say they come up with about 2 names, and maybe there's 5, but they can't think of the other 3. So it's really a kind of small number of people who are seriously looking at the science in a contemporary sense, who are unhappy about it. And often, I think, the people who are in that category are not engaging with the current research activity.